Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Visions of the Future, using art and storytelling to confront climate anxiety. We're so excited to welcome you to our panel this evening, featuring artists and mental health practitioners. I'm Kailani, and I'm a fourth-year Ph.D. student in Earth Environmental Sciences at Columbia.
I'm Benjamin, and I'm a postdoctoral researcher at Columbia.
I want to start by amplifying the work and the words of the Native American Council at Columbia University. The Lenape lived here before and during the colonization of the Americas. We recognize these Indigenous people of Manhattan, their displacement, dispossession, and continued presence. This acknowledgement stands as a reminder to reflect on our past as we contemplate our way forward.
We would like to thank the Earth Institute and the Columbia Climate School for sponsoring tonight's event. This event will be moderated by Lauren Ritchie, who is a 20-year-old climate activist, writer, podcast host, and fourth-year student in sustainable development at Columbia University. She is the creator of the Eco-Justice Project, which is a digital platform that educates on climate justice, promotes intersectional climate action, and seeks to make sustainable living more accessible and inclusive by amplifying the voices of marginalized communities. She is also a writer and content strategist for Brown Girl Green, a youth ambassador for the Plastic Pollution Coalition, and the co-host of the podcast Black Girl Blueprint, a platform to center the voices and celebrate the accomplishments of young Black women in a vast array of fields. Please join me in welcoming your moderator and host for the rest of the evening, Lauren Ritchie.
Thank you, Ben and Kailani, and thank you everyone for tuning in to tonight's event. I'm so excited. I think this is a really important conversation to be having, especially as, eco-anxiety is on the rise, as we fear what, will happen to the future of our planet. There's a lot to be discussed when it comes to the intersection with mental health and climate change, but also storytelling and art and activism and empowerment and all of the different avenues for getting involved and telling stories. So I'm very excited for the panelists that we have here today. We have representation of filmmakers, writers, artists, and mental health practitioners. And without further ado, I will let them introduce themselves and the work that they do. So we'll start with Rasheena. Please let us know.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Lauren, again for hosting this. Super excited to be here. So my name is Rasheena. I'm an essayist, a poet, an educator. A lot of my work focuses on Black land relationships, environmental memory, counter narratives, and decolonization, and more. I am currently a Ph.D. student in English and literature at the University of Washington, and I'm busy revising a memoir that I've written that is about Black land relationships and counter narratives and myths. Yeah, so happy to be here.
Thank you, Rasheena. Tracy?
Hi, greetings everyone. I'm Tracy Rector, and I'm calling in from the traditional territories of the Puyallup people, 30 miles south of Seattle, Washington. I'm a filmmaker, arts curator, activist. I've been working towards Black liberation and Indigenous sovereignty for 35 years now. And currently I'm the managing director of storytelling at Neotero. And we work globally with Indigenous peoples to secure land rights. We support land protectors, water protectors, culture keepers, Indigenous artists. And I just love being in this space. And I'm really inspired by everybody getting their PhDs. Thank you.
Thank you, Tracy. Taylor?
Hi, everyone. My name is Taylor. I'm 18 years old, originally from Seattle, Washington. Seems like a lot of people here are from Seattle, the ancestral land of the Duwamish. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm an artist whose work primarily centers around mental illness, queerness, and the Asian American experience. In the past, I've done mainly editorial work for publications like the Seattle Times and the South Seattle Emerald, focused on youth narratives and Asian American narratives. I'm in my freshman year of university, and I currently work as a book illustrator and graphic designer. And also, like everyone else, a big thank you to Lauren for organizing this. And yeah, I'm just really excited to have this conversation alongside these wonderful people.
Thank you. And Wendy.
Hello, everyone, and thank you, Lauren, for including me in this wonderful panel. I'm probably the outlier here, not being in the arts. I'm the psychologist of the group, so I'm a clinical psychologist, psychoanalyst, and now call myself a climate psychologist. So I had worked for many years at Columbia in the counseling service with students, started running workshops to help support students who were studying environmental science, sustainability, learning about the climate crisis, the distress they were feeling. And that really led me to leave my job to really focus more primarily on climate distress, climate anxiety, and support activists. I'm part of the Climate Psychology Alliance of North America. I'm a board member, steering committee member. I'm teaching and presenting to mental health professionals so they can be better equipped to help in the crisis and to manage the amount of distress that's happening. Yeah, that's me. Thank you.
Thank you, Wendy. Thank you to all of you. I'm so excited for this conversation. I think this is probably going to be one of the favorite conversations that I have, just because I think, you know, the intersections that we have going on here are so interesting, just for such, you know, a fulfilling and well-rounded conversation. And Wendy, I don't believe in outliers. I think the mental health aspect of this goes so well with storytelling and Rasheena's, you know, essay work coming from such a personal place, and, you know, empowerment and just trying to find your place within just such a complex system that is the climate crisis is a big part of this conversation. So just getting right into it, I would just love to hear from each of you, you know, what led you to the work that you do, whether that is, you know, in the environmental space or within mental health or art or activism. I'd just love to hear more about what it was, you know, that influenced the stories that you choose to tell and how you choose to do this work. Anyone can jump in also.
I'll hop in. So I see being in service to the environment and community almost like, you know, water or food or exercise. It feels like a spiritual practice. And I felt this way since I was young, that I just really wanted to make sure that I was using my time to uplift something outside of myself and to contribute back to community, but also contribute back to Earth. And have always been taught and have felt that we're not separate from Earth, that we're part of Earth. And so all of our actions, all of our giving back is a aspect of wealth, is an aspect of care and extension of ourselves and our spirit. And so, you know, I've been part of service work, whether it's been, you know, as a domestic violence counselor, working in an apothecary, working in a traditional garden for a tribal elder, teaching K through 12, or filmmaking. And it all feels like it's intersectional, it's interconnected. And when I began filmmaking, one of the things that really struck me is, you know, I'm a latchkey kid. I grew up in a pretty broken home, you know, with quite a bit of dysfunction, and just navigating that as a young person. I found myself watching a ton of TV, and that was my escape. And as I started teaching filmmaking, you know, I recognized those young ones who had stories to tell, but maybe, you know, weren't quite sure how to bring their lived experiences forward. And so filmmaking was an awesome way for those young people to connect their life experiences, share those really interesting stories with the world, which I recognized was kind of unlocking a lot of healing. You know, and, you know, being a multicultural mixed race person, I never saw anybody on TV that looked like me or had a lived experience like me. or my family. And so I could also see this in the young people in the tribal communities we were working with, that there was just this craving to see themselves reflected back, you know, not to be these stereotypes, to, you know, want to be authentic in the storytelling and to be seen and heard and contribute. So that was the beginning work, you know, in terms of how I came to storytelling and filmmaking. And as a person who just like loves to have their hands in the earth and the dirt and to utilize plant medicine, but also, you know, drawing from that time of sitting in front of the TV, watching a lot of movies and shows. I love stories, and it feels like an honor to be present hearing other people's stories. So this has been an amazing life journey, you know, at this point, combining all of this work. And I get to actually witness and support storytellers for a full-time job now, who are most often committed to, you know, finding ways that we can be in better relationship with one another and the earth. So that's how I came to where I am today. Thank you.
Thank you, Tracy.
I can jump in. Thank you, Tracy, for sharing that story. Yeah, I have always been a writer. I was a person that didn't really talk. I was always quiet and super internal. So writing poetry was a way that I made sense of the world. Yeah, I started doing it, I would say, as a child on the west side of Chicago. And it's just how I made sense of my upbringing. So I've always knew that I would be a writer, knew that I fit, even though I try to do something different. That's just what I end up being best at. But it was when I was on my path to writing, but I took an English class in eco-criticism. And that was like the first time that I had really thought critically about the environment in as I've come to know it now. So reading Silent Spring, thinking about things like pollution, that was not something I ever thought about, even though I grew up on the west side of Chicago partly. There was a lot of environmental injustice in that neighborhood. So I was outside all the time, did have a natural connection, but I think because, again, I didn't see people in nature shows or representations of environmentalism that looked like me. So I think that I saw it as separate. So taking that course was my introduction into realizing that it was the environment was more than this like stagnant thing that is just around me, that it could influence my life expectancy. It could influence all kinds of things, and probably did. But what I noticed in that course and what really drew me in was what wasn't there, what stories I wasn't reading. So that inquiry was, where are all the Black stories? Where are stories of people that look like me? And I think that put me on a long deviation, but I think for a good reason. And so even though I was undergrad in creative writing, I decided to start taking science courses. I decided to take pollution courses or do anything that I could to kind of learn more, because I know that I wanted to somehow contribute to counter narratives, I guess, or contribute to discovering like, what does an environmental relationship look like for someone like me? How do I engage? What does that look like for the west side of Chicago? So I would say that that was my drive, and wanting to be closer to the land as well, like wanting a close land relationship. I have more to say, about like learning, like about like, relearning that I did have one, even though it wasn't like shown in popular media. But I would say that literature is what got me thinking about environmental relationships. So I think that that's why I'm driven to write. And I think that it can have impact.
I can go next. First, very powerful words from Rasheena and Tracy. I feel like I can really relate to that idea of channeling your personal experiences into art making. So a little background about my art. I've been drawing and painting for as long as I can remember. In high school, I was a graphic designer for Space to Speak, which is a youth-founded organization advocating for survivors of sexual assault and domestic violence. I also worked with local museums and galleries to put on art shows for underserved young artists. And as for my own practice, I mainly work with illustrative mediums. So gouache and ink for traditional art and Photoshop for digital art. And I've always said I'm a bit of a masochist because I love adding like tiny little details that literally nobody will ever notice. But I tried learning about art and art history through YouTube videos in high school, but they all kind of just kept referencing like the same dead white guys. So I feel like I found my inspirations mostly from the online space, from interacting with other young artists and learning from them. I think that shared wisdom is so important in any collective space, and being online is also what drew me into the climate discussion as well. So my main experience in the space of environmentalism is a climate art residency I did at an organization called Our Climate Voices. The residency gave space for a handful of artists to investigate how climate anxiety has affected this generation's mental health. And since the residency was catered specifically towards young emerging artists, it was many of our first times working in such a space and unraveling our own emotions towards climate change. So I guess that was my first time considering how I actually felt about it. And I was able to explore the connections between the climate crisis and colonialism, Orientalism, the destructive effects of a settler colonial state claiming land and resources for themselves, right, prioritizing the individual over the collective, which is really what has led to this climate catastrophe. And so throughout the residency, I learned a lot. We got to do workshops together, hear from guest speakers and facilitators, and above all, learn from each other's experiences. So more than anything, I was grateful for the opportunity to hear from fellow artists, especially queer and BIPOC artists all over the world, about their different climate narratives. And it definitely also showed me how important these spaces are, where young people get to engage in discussion and practice together. Because working in isolation isn't really going to get you anywhere, ultimately, in my opinion. Like, it's a good start, but I believe the important work happening will always be work that's occurring among groups, coalitions, and collective movements.
Yes, it's my turn. Thank you all. I was just so moved by each of your stories and thinking about, maybe I'm not as much of a storyteller as a story listener. And so I'm taken by listening to all of the stories. And that's probably how I started to get engaged in this arena. I mean, from my own past, my initial training was as a family therapist. So I learned about thinking systemically, that thinking about interconnection, as Tracy and others were already talking about, and not seeing individuals as primary, but really thinking about context and context of family, culture, race, and the land. And so that's always been a part of my background in terms of the way I thought. As the climate crisis has worsened, for years and years, I thought I need to do something, I need to get involved, but I felt so small and so unable to know what I could do to get engaged. And I think it was actually a story that I read, a fictional story that was about a kind of a climate apocalyptic future, and the young people in the story were saying, people knew this was going to happen, why didn't they do anything? And there was something about that story that broke through my own sense of powerlessness, that I needed to do something. I have a daughter. I was thinking of her future. I was thinking of other young people's futures. I've worked with young people for most of my career. And so I started joining climate activist groups, talking to young people and realizing, I think someone at a talk I went to said, do what you know how to do and what your passions are. And I thought, well, I'm a therapist. So what can I do as a clinician? Well, how can I use my capacity to heal and to listen to facilitate others? And that's when I started doing the workshops I referenced, and joined with other clinicians and had to go through my own climate distress, getting support from being interconnected, learning about environmental injustice, environmental racism, the intersectionality of various social harms that are all connected with similar roots in colonialism, as Taylor was talking about, BIPOC folks who have not really been listened to. And so that's part of the way I think about teaching other mental health professionals too, ways that we need to amplify the voices of those who've not been listened to.
Thank you all. You've all just shared such moving insights. And I think something that I find just amazing about this type of conversation that we're having here and the space that we're able to cultivate by having this conversation is there's so many differences, in the upbringings and the way that you've connected with nature or come into the work in environmentalism, but also there are these common threads that we see, in the interconnectedness with the earth or the lack of representation or just this desire to want to do change. And the common thread also is just, how deeply personal this is, I think, for all of us. And, within the climate movement, I think there is this focus on the policy side, and there is this focus on, climate action as this kind of broader, complex problem that doesn't talk as much about the individual impacts or these personal connections. And I even had someone ask me recently, even with, doing panels or the work that I like to do with social media and exploring filmmaking and art in these different mediums that aren't typically associated with environmental science or environmentalism is really interesting, because they had asked whether or not that was something that was a downfall. But actually, as Tracy was saying, or even as everyone was highlighting, there's something very, very beautiful about being able to highlight your strengths or find your passions within these movements and, be able to adapt that to fight, and be a part of this mission. So I think that's all very beautiful. And on that topic, I think it's also really interesting to explore this conversation about storytelling, about art and creativity, whether it's from the perspective of the storyteller or the story listener, just more about how art and creativity in these different mediums can help individuals to address and confront these deeply personal issues, but also conceptions about the future, as we're about to talk about with climate anxiety and mental health and, empowerment for action.
Yeah, maybe I could share about a project that I'm working on currently as kind of a response. So last April, was it last April or April 2020? The time is just really, it's hard to track right now. But April 2020, right in the thick of being in lockdown, I was just reflecting on how for the first time I could hear the birds outside. There wasn't any cars, there weren't airplanes. And it's not that I could just hear birds. I mean, I heard birds all the time, but I could really hear the birds like miles out. It was incredible. I was like, oh my gosh, is like, is it that we can hear because there's just all this noise pollution? Or are they just really coming out and happy? And it made me think, just sitting there, are we in this crisis? What's going to happen? And just, holding that fear and that trauma and thinking about, what at my work, what can we do to adapt to continue telling stories despite our circumstances? And we began thinking about, well, we could tell stories about this moment in time, and we can choose that path. We could choose like, we're in a crisis, that kind of language. Or maybe it's a moment to present some solutions. Maybe it's a moment to present ways of being that people have lived since time immemorial, or even current contemporary practices that practice, being in balance. And so that's when we started this new storytelling project called Reciprocity Project. And we decided to go to 7 tribal communities to just say, what does reciprocity mean to you? And for all of them, there wasn't a singular word. It was just a way, that life was lived. And all of them chose to create a film and to tell a story. And within this, there is these lessons. And oftentimes those lessons were about sharing, mutual aid, not consuming too much, all of these things that matter today that are kind of some basic principles that I think individualism, capitalism has really strived to want us to forget, that these are natural ways of being in community. It's been so incredible to be working on something healing during this time, because I'm a human and I'm constantly, checking myself and my body, and like my physical reactions are saying that I'm scared, but I'm trying to, calm my mind, calm my spirit, calm my heart by taking these steps, by supporting these stories, by remembering that there are people who are doing the work, remembering that there are people who are leading the way. And that's been so important at this moment in time.
Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, I'm thinking about the birds. Yeah. Yeah, I can. So I will say that writing for me, and especially in the last 3 years, working on my project. And so the project was for my MFA program, and I thought when I started the project that it would be about the trauma I faced or responding to, again, counter narratives, or but over the years as I worked on it, I spent a lot of time learning about my ancestors. So learning about my grandmother, who I knew, who I was really close with, but interviewing my mother and asking more about that. And so instead of being like field focused, it began to be intimately connected to just my family and their ways of knowing, and their close land relationships, or like realizing that they had a really close land relationship. So my grandmother was a sharecropper from Mississippi, and other parts of my family have done migrations north and things like that. But so I guess what it ended up being was I started to learn more about environmental relationships. I started to think differently about my own environmental relationship. I found myself wanting to turn away and from scarcity to abundance, right? And to lean into those moments of joy, because that's, what I thought about, or as I learned about my family's history and some of the things that were traumatic, I also was able to find like moments of joy. My grandmother in her garden on the west side of Chicago, right, in a concrete area, but she had this patch, and so. So yeah, I will say that in terms of looking back at the history, I also was able to look back at my ancestors' relationship to reimagine my own, right? And so be future forward. And so I use a lot of like reimagining and improvisation within the memories that I'm looking at. And so in terms of like using creativity to reimagine, I think that part of the work that I have been led to is to help other people remember. And so, maybe me putting out my project is like in the tradition of call and response, right? So this is Yeah, so I guess like that would be like one way I'm looking back in history, using creativity and being able to use that history to reimagine and improvise over the constant, right? The constant is anxiety and
I guess we can keep going in this order. So for me, I've always used art as an outlet, I would say, for processing traumatic experiences. For instance, growing up, feeling alienated and confused due to my intersecting identities of being queer and Chinese and female. I didn't really have therapy or mental health support as an option in my community back home. So art was really always the place I turned to when I felt like I had these unresolved or lingering feelings of anxiety or depression. And I think that also applies to the sphere of climate change activism. But for me, community has always deeply inspired my art, being around other artists since a very young age, mainly through this magical place called the internet, where I basically gravitate to as early as like elementary or middle school, and where I found this community of fellow artists who were exploring their own struggles through art and improving together. So that's been really profound experience, this notion that even if your relationship with your biological family is complicated, you can still find family online that transcends blood and borders and time zones. One recurring story that I've been exploring in my art lately is this idea that just because bad things have happened to you doesn't mean that you are bad. So I feel like for a long time, I struggled with this enormous shame and guilt and sense of taboo over a lot of the experiences that feel unfortunately quintessential to the Asian American identity. So like sexual violence, fetishization, abuse, the spike in hate crimes. And so currently I'm approaching this question of how to depict these struggles honestly, whilst not allowing the trauma to overshadow the fact that it's not all bad. There's also joy and pride, which is often not portrayed in immigrant narratives. And so similar to Rasheena, scarcity over abundance, leaning into joy. So for example, I recently made a portrait of an Asian activist from the 1900s. And I also did an oil painting for a museum in my hometown's Chinatown, suggesting economic vitality, surplus, and plentifulness, these themes which are usually not associated with immigration. So yeah, right now I have this kind of, I guess, like tenuous relationship with art, and how it should tactfully depict both the good and the bad. And yeah, I'm just looking forward to continuing to explore that.
Well, thank you. I feel like I get the benefit of going last in the line, and I get to sort of absorb the wisdom that has already preceded. And I was really struck in everyone's stories that you really touch on what I often try to convey when I do workshops on building emotional resilience in the face of climate distress. So many themes, and so it's both really validating and a bit humbling, because it's a reminder of part of what I say in presenting is that you don't have to go to a mental health professional to get help with climate distress. I mean, there are so many forums and sources of resilience, of coping, of finding beauty, of finding joy, of turning to history, the wisdom of the past, of your people, of the land. I was just really struck by that. And I guess the other thing I'll say is when I think about, I often use the term climate distress because I think climate anxiety kind of narrows it. It makes it sound like there's only one feeling, and anxiety may be more anticipatory sometimes, as opposed to those who've already been suffering harms. I think people feel a lot of grief, they feel anger, they feel shame, guilt for complicity, and sometimes a numbness or a shutting down. And so I think creative pursuits are one way to engage with the emotions and transform them from something that feels unbearable into something that is an expression and can hold some of the pain and the difficulty, and there's beauty within that. And so I think those who are expressing and using creative pursuits, it really is a way of I think of composting the emotions. You know, we have to sort of turn them over and add new things to them, and they can grow into something different. And I think that's a theme that everyone here has already shared. So just wanted to say that.
Thank you, Wendy. I really like that last image that you presented with, you know, these mediums and this creativity and the storytelling being something to hold all of these emotions, and for them to be such complex emotions, with, like you said, the grief. You know, there's like, especially the distinction between people who have been suffering or have been, you know, enduring these climate disasters for decades, for generations, for centuries, compared, you know, to the individuals who see the climate disaster as something impending, even as something that will occur in the future instead of something that's already happening. And I'd love to dive into these feelings of climate distress now, and just, you know, a lot of people don't really see the connection between climate change and mental health in, you know, this clear and this personal way. And I'd just love to outline just how climate change and environmental injustice affect mental health, and how climate, you know, distress or these feelings manifest. But also, even if you wanted to include how your own experiences with climate distress, we've talked about it a little bit before, but how that, you know, influences your work to be motivated to work on these issues and helping others. We could keep the same order.
Okay, I'll jump in. A personal experience I have is that about 6 years ago here in Seattle, in August, we started really getting the fallout from the fires. So pretty extreme ash, you know, like ashes falling from the sky, almost looked like snow sometimes. Pretty intense smog and pollution to the point where people were wearing masks around. And it was just hard to breathe. And I started doing research when I first experienced this 6 years ago. And I've grown up here my whole life, so this is a big change, very noticeable change. I started noticing I was just kind of depressed and irritable, you know, in August. I was just like kind of a consistent grade of irritation and just not wanting to do much of anything, but also hearing these messages like it's, you know, there's a warning for going out, there's a warning for breathing in this air quality, but then just also looking out, it was just palpable that, wow, these fires are close and something serious is happening in our lifetime. And I started doing research, and it turns out that when you impact your breathing, it does lead to certain forms of, it expresses itself in your emotions and your mental health when your breathing's suppressed in that way. But this has been our reality every year since. And so now I'm even beginning to plan for this. Okay, August is when the forest fires are closed. This is when the air gets really bad. And it's such a strange feeling to think about, okay, now we're planning, like at least I am, now I'm planning for, this is going to be a hard month emotionally. And just making sure that I'm either away or I have what I need to be nurtured and to reduce stress, because I know it's going to be an emotional, emotionally challenging time. But wow, right? Just in our lifetime, a major shift in that way. And right then and there, connecting climate crisis and mental health for me is when it became most visible.
Yeah, I think this is one of the harder questions for me, a little bit. Not because, so I would say definitely in the last couple of years, I've had family who wouldn't necessarily use climate change, feel the effects, and then start to say like, this is an issue. Like I had, my family is in Illinois, and there's been some strong storms, some weather events that displaced my family for a bit. But I will say that in terms of my approach to my work, mostly everything I write is interconnected with other, tied to other issues. So, so in terms of like displacement, that's something that I know is climate change related, right? So, so I would say like in anxiety related, it's hard for me to disconnect the different types of anxiety, if that makes sense. So, so yeah, like I said, I'm from the west side of Chicago. There is ongoing anxiety in terms of my old community, Austin, that in terms of gun violence, right? In terms of displacement, right? That isn't weather related. So, so yeah, I will say that, yeah, I struggle with that, but I have heard families start to talk more about the environmental concerns because they've been affected by it and haven't had, have realized that they don't have a safety net, right, when those issues do happen.
So I'm also from Washington, and I feel like it's just really sad to like devastating to see more and more forest fires given how beautiful the PNW's natural environment is. And I remember like my neighbor's house burned down my freshman year because of the arid summer air. My dad's workplace almost burned down because of like the fires on the West Coast. And everyone was basically being cautioned to like stay at home, don't go outside unless you have to. And it just felt super apocalyptic. And so I remember it's like this little art piece I drew about like the super unnatural red and pink sky. And it was getting a lot of traction on Instagram and a lot of people DMing me like, oh my God, that's what it looks like outside my house too. So again, I think that like art and storytelling are such interesting ways to forge those connections. And just like on another note, I feel like the people who end up most suffering from mental health issues due to climate change aren't those who are effectuating climate change, but rather BIPOC, disenfranchised people, people from the global South, refugees, immigrants, people who have really no control over the forces that are accelerating ecological destruction. So I feel like an important step forward would be to mobilize more robust mental health services and resources for those people, the people who need it the most. And also like in general, just taking care of each other, checking in with your friends, being more kind and gentle towards yourself as well. I feel like I'm also guilty of like perpetrating this idea that my self-worth is dependent on my productivity. And sometimes it's just important to recognize, in my opinion, that like a system dependent on endless unimpeded growth and expansion is just impossible to sustain. And that's the very system that led to our current climate crisis. So as a result, you shouldn't be constantly trying to one-up yourself and just trying to like work nonstop. And yeah, I feel like the pandemic especially has just totally shattered that work mindset and perhaps hopefully laid the foundation for a new reality where we prioritize ourselves and our mental well-being more than our productivity.
Wow, that was lovely again. What you just said, Taylor, reminded me of one of the recent climate psychology books talks about fostering a culture of care, and that's really at the heart of what we're needing. So I was really struck by that. I think like many mental health professionals, you know, I've had my own struggles with stress and distress and anxiety, and certainly in the climate realm that happened too. When I first went back to Colorado where I grew up and went to the mountains and saw what used to be sort of beautiful blankets of green pine trees, they were brown and withered like skeletons almost on the mountainsides. And because the pine beetles had proliferated as temperatures are warming, the beetles have two life cycles where they used to have one because they can live for longer in the warmth, and they were just eating all the pine trees. So I think many people here have already said when they felt some personal impact on land that they cared about, or the health of the air around them, or the personal impact is sometimes when we notice and feel it. I know for myself, when I started preparing the first class I was teaching on, it was called Eco Psychoanalysis, I started reading a lot about what was going on in climate and environment and environmental injustice. And I just got completely overwhelmed. I wasn't sleeping. I felt anxiety. And I had to learn. I was lucky I had a co-teacher, and we would meet weekly, and we still meet weekly, one-on-one, to talk about our climate distress and to find ways to manage. And now we have groups of people who meet, and I'm fostering support for clinicians who are doing climate work. And we run things that we call climate cafes. It's different than climate cafes that I think happen at Columbia. But they're based on, it's a reflective model of gathering people together in a shared reflective space. No intention about action per se, but to really be together in the grief and the pain and to hold each other. And so that's been really meaningful for me in terms of both facilitating, but being part of this interconnected sense of what we're all facing and what comes up for us in different ways across time.
I agree. Yeah, I do think it is interesting, this idea of seeing something personal happen to the environment, or even in the beginning of the conversation, we were talking, you know, a lot about what it looks like to care for the earth, to engage with the earth, especially thinking about, you know, ancestral roots or, you know, community in the way that Taylor was talking about, and what it's like to see that disrupted or to see those changes and the feelings that it brings out in you. But also, even in my experience, I grew up in the Bahamas. I was in the sun all the time. I was on the beach, and I felt, you know, very close to nature because I could see nature all of the time. And then all of a sudden I moved to New York City. It's raining. It's dark. I'm in my room, and nature and, you know, my relationship to earth feels a lot further away. And I'm forced to figure out how, you know, to reconcile with, you know, feeling like the earth, which has been so close to me for so long, is so distant, but also the ability, I think, to be able to adapt and to expand that relationship into the storytelling or the mediums that you can use, I think is also really powerful. So we have about 10 minutes left. I'm going to remind people that they can leave questions in the chat. I think I'll ask my own question for the time being, which I think is something that I'm actually personally very, very curious about. I think when you are doing this work, especially because it just is so taxing. And I even think about, you know, some of my classes, you have all of these complex issues, and it seems like every solution that you come to also has a downside, or, you know, there always seems to be another thing that pops up or another issue to face. And especially with, you know, reading the news or social media and the accessibility of this information or the detriment that's happening to our planet is accessible and in front of our faces. I'm very curious to hear from each of you, just personally, what it's looked like for you engaging within this movement, especially over the past couple of years, and how you've been able to use those like personal experiences to remain engaged in the face of all of these things.
I'll jump in again. I mean, aside from the work and being a longtime supporter of frontline workers and Indigenous peoples and nations who are land defenders, you know, 80% of the world's biodiversity is on Indigenous held territories. So just really being part of the movement of recognizing Indigenous rights as environmental rights, all of our rights, it matters to all of us. But more personally, I have to say, my 20-year-old son, he was in school, you know, March of 2020, a school shut down due to the pandemic. And so he moved home. And I have a little dog behind me, sorry. He moved home. And in April 2020, he started volunteering for a farm here near the Puyallup Reservation. And he's been volunteering straight 2 to 3 days a week for the last 2 years. And personally, as a mama, I'm just like, I'm so thankful he's home. That's the silver lining. I'm so thankful that he's in community. His hands are in the ground. He's showing up. He's committed. It's like young people, there's so much hope, when I hear his stories about connecting with the land and uplifting mostly women who are out there too and their children, and just how grateful he is to be able to be supportive. And I saw an IG post from his mentor out there, and she's holding, this hand of morel mushrooms, and she's talking about how hard things have been for her as a single mom lately. And she said, when Solomon came up to me with these mushrooms and said, here are some helpers, these are helper mushrooms. And she had no idea that they were in her garden. And she just talked about like, that was such a healing moment. I was like, yes, as a mom, it's like that's my hope, is that hopefully, however I've, contributed and walked this path with this young person in this world, that they're contributing to a positive future for all.
That's wonderful. Yeah, maybe, yeah, that was wonderful. So yeah, how do I stay engaged? I think again, I would say that I had a shift within the pandemic, or just shifting over the few years, about being responsive and like, so I guess like giving myself permission to have moments of joy, whether that's like me dancing in the kitchen every morning, and making sure. So yeah, I think inviting birds into my yard, like getting a lot of feeders, and trying to connect with the nature that is around me. I live in the city as well. So I will say that, and also, I'm an introvert, but really leaning into collective healing, doing a lot of collaborations with people, saying yes to collaborations a lot, in whether that's like doing music. I was in throughout a lot of the pandemic, poet Jordan Keith in Seattle, wonderful poet, that created Women in Wales, and a cohort. And so during a lot of the heavy part of the pandemic, I was meeting with Jordan and other poets, and we're writing about whales, and rethinking our relationality with the more than humans. So that's something that's been healing while doing the work. Yeah, and also spending a lot of time with my daughter, and seeing her have that care about nature, and she cares enough to save worms that are on the ground that she thinks are going to dry up. So yeah, so like seeing that the next generation is having that relationship, and that gives me hope as well.
First, I just want to say it's been so amazing to hear everyone's stories, not just about your work, but also about like your families and your kids. I think that for me, because art is so limitless and boundaryless, there's just so much potential to envision possible futures. And art is also like necessarily open to interpretation. So it really creates avenues for people to project their own experiences, even if that's not what the artist originally intended to convey. And so that multiplicity of narratives and that exchange of ideas is really conducive to community building and coalition building, in my opinion. And I feel like that's what's so meaningful about the presence of art in any movement. And personally, I'm also really interested in exploring the role the internet has in the future. I mean, the digital world is a big reason why so many communities and coalitions are able to form across different states, even countries, and really build an international solidarity. And so as for me, I stumbled upon the online art community at a really young age. And I know artists who found a platform among audiences numbering in the thousands or even millions through social media, which is just a really intriguing way that we're connecting with each other, especially given like the current moratorium on real life interactions because of COVID. And lastly, I guess I just want to say, like, in my personal experience, in high school, I worked for this nonprofit called the Washington Bus, which advocates for political engagement among young people. And through the process, I met so many wonderful people working in this space, climate activism, but also racial equality, gender equality, housing equity, and other adjacent spheres. So I just felt really grateful to be able to engage and learn about these people's work whilst working alongside them and being able to contribute my skill set of illustration and design to their cause. And I'm just perpetually stunned by the stories I illustrate and the people I meet when I collaborate with these organizations, people who know so much more than me and are willing to educate, to share their lived experiences. So to me, like, these aren't merely transactional relationships, but also people who I admire and respect on an interpersonal level. And so forging these connections has just like unequivocally been the best part of being an artist.
Well, I think in terms of my own being able to keep doing this work, my first thought is being on panels like this. I mean, it really joining with others and learning how others are engaging, coping, finding hope, building creativity. I mean, I just feel it's easier to bear what we're facing when we know we're not alone. And I'm always interested in learning other people's stories. I was struck, Rasheena, when you said earlier, it was hard for you to name kind of climate as separate from all the other experiences of harm, of difficulty, that the intersectionality. And I think that was my own awakening too. My own climate distress was about my white privilege, really, that I hadn't experienced these kind of harms, and learning from others and hearing the stories of people who've been historically marginalized and experiencing harms helped wake up another layer of my own disavowal, you know, what I kept pushing out of my own sight. And so I just feel like immense gratitude, and that's really, really helped me in bearing this. And then the other thing is just being in nature, which I think other people have said. I know during this pandemic, living in New York City, I just take walks on the river every day, and I started forming a relationship with the river, and that has kept me going.
Thank you. Well, thank you all for being here and for your presence. We have 1 minute left, but yes, thank you for the space. If you want to quickly plug anything before we go, Tracy, I know you have to leave right at 7, but just quick goodbyes, and thank you all for being here. This is an absolute pleasure. You're all so insightful, and I'm thankful.
Quickly, thank you for your graciousness, Lauren. I appreciate being invited into this space. It was a real treat to meet everybody, and yeah, just really beautiful and unexpected. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Lauren, for putting this together and for hosting these conversations. They just seem so important.
Thank you. Well, that's everything. Thank you all for tuning in, and yes, see you later. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.